Welcome to the Berkley Center. I'm Tom Farr, Director of the Religious Freedom Project here at the Berkley Center for Religion, Peace, and World Affairs. And I'm delighted to welcome you to this book event, which promises to be exciting, an intellectual feast on an issue, a hot topic. How do you like that? Intellectual feast on a hot topic. I don't know if you can get much hotter than the issue of religious freedom, the issues that we're facing today. Before we begin, though, if I might, just say a word about the Religious Freedom Project. Our purpose, we've been around now for about 1 year here in the Berkley Center, and our purpose is to increase the study of religious freedom, both in the academy and in the policy worlds. And we do this by a series of symposia and meetings and book events such as this one, as well as by putting together a team of scholars. We call them our Religious Freedom Project, or RFP scholars, an international team, two of them sitting here today, Roger Trigg, who wrote the book. It's the subject of our meeting today, and also Tim Shaw, whom I'll introduce in just a second. You have in front of you a pamphlet that will tell you about our program and will, more importantly, tell you about our scholars and some of the events that are coming up. Let me just mention a couple. On March 1st, we are going to be rolling out with a full conference, a full day of panels, a book written by my colleague Tim Shaw entitled Religious Freedom, Why Now? Defending an Embattled Human Right. The keynote address for that conference, which will be here on the campus of Georgetown University, will be Robert George, a professor of political science and the holder of a prestigious chair at Princeton University, and a whole host of very interesting people who, in a couple of panels, we'll have that day. That's March 1st. We invite you to join us. Then on March 16th, we're going to have an event, again on Georgetown campus, Religious Freedom and Religion-Related Terrorism, Violent Religious Extremism and Terrorism. We'll have, again, a series of panels highlighted by a keynote discussion this time with a number of people, including the former National Security Council Assistant to the President, Steve Hadley, Elliot Abrams of the Council on Foreign Relations. We're hoping we're going to get Dennis Ross and a couple of other people. So this will be a fascinating discussion about the relationship between religious freedom and religion-related terrorism. We feel here at the Religious Freedom Project that the advancement of religious freedom is a peaceful, diplomatic way to counter religious extremism. And you want to hear more about that, come to our event on March 16th. Then finally, I'll mention you're all invited to come over to Oxford, but if you can't make it, in the UK in the middle of April, we're going to have an event co-sponsored with Roger Trigg's Kellogg College at Oxford University. We're going to have an event on emerging conflicts between religious freedom and other rights claims, such as the claim of homosexual rights, the right to gay marriage, in the United States and Canada, in the UK and Ireland, and in continental Europe. We'll have 3 panels on each of those with a keynote address by a prominent Catholic Bishop of Scotland, Philip Tartaglia. Okay, so please join us. Become partners with us. Come to our events. Get on our email listserv and find out about the things that we have to offer. So let me, without further ado, turn this over to the Associate Director of the Religious Freedom Project, who's going to be our moderator today, Tim Shaw.
Thank you very much, Tom. And thank you all for being here. And let me warmly thank also our distinguished speakers, Roger Trigg, Helen Alvaré, and Bill Galston. Roger could not possibly have known 3 years ago when he started to write this book, or 4 years ago, that at the very moment as his book is being launched in the United States and simultaneously in England, that there would be an intense debate at that very moment concerning the relationship between principles of equality, and in this case, equal access to health care, and religious liberty. But that is just what is happening. Those of you who've been paying attention know very well that there is a very intense, very passionate, and still unresolved debate concerning the relationship between the healthcare law and recently promulgated regulations concerning the provision of preventive services and religious liberty. Just on Friday, a new compromise was offered by the administration with respect to this emerging conflict. And of course, as we all realize, this conflict, this controversy, this debate is being framed explicitly in terms of religious freedom. And let me just quote from the statement, the brief statement that President Obama made concerning the proposed compromise on Friday. He said, first, that as part of the health care reform law that I signed last year, all insurance plans are required to cover preventive care at no cost. But then he hastened to say, as we move to implement this rule, we've been mindful that there is another principle at stake here, and that's the principle of religious liberty, an inalienable right that is enshrined in our Constitution. As a citizen and as a Christian, I cherish this right. In other words, we are at this very moment in a debate that's explicitly, even by the President of the United States, being framed in terms of an eagerness to issue certain regulations in a way that's equitable and a desire, concern to respect religious liberty that's conceived of explicitly as a right enshrined in our Constitution and one that is inalienable. This is intrinsically a difficult set of issues, a challenging set of issues, and thankfully we have to discuss this challenging and difficult set of issues outstanding scholars and experts, Roger Trigg, Helen Alvaré, and Bill Galston. I'm, of course, going to first ask Roger Trigg, the man of the hour, the author of an outstanding new book on precisely these issues, to speak first. Roger will be followed by Helen Alvaré, and then we will have Bill Galston. So I will introduce the speakers in turn. Let me first say a little bit about Roger Trigg. Roger Trigg is a philosopher who is now based at Kellogg College in Oxford. He spent much of his career at the University of Warwick. He is a philosopher who has worked on many, many areas of philosophy of religion, philosophy of mind. He's worked increasingly in moral and political philosophy. You have a more complete biography in front of you, and you have biographies of the other speakers as well. I will point out that I'm proud to say that Roger Trigg is an important part of and a fellow with our Religious Freedom Project and is a regular and integral part of the work of the Religious Freedom Project. So it's a special pleasure and privilege to welcome Roger here to kick off our discussion. Roger?
Good. Well, thank you very much. Yes, I knew I was getting involved in a hot topic, but I didn't quite realize how hot before, well, as I was getting going with it, I found that it was getting even more topical. Now, it's almost impossible to pick up a newspaper on either side of the Atlantic without finding a major news story about it. I'll just start with this last weekend. Tim has already talked about the whole furore about healthcare and the mandate, etc. I just make two comments on that. First, that I do think that religious freedom applies to institutions as well as individuals. And I think that's very important. So in a lot of the arguments about this, we do see arguments about the role of institutions. And secondly, I think there's a great tendency, which I'll come back to narrow the notion of what it is to be religious or a religious institution or for religion to come into play. Sometimes people are very inclined to talk about freedom of worship rather than freedom of religion. And I think that there is a tendency sometimes to narrow down the kind of institutions that one might think are exemplifying a religious conscience. Perhaps you can see that at work in some of these healthcare regulations. Anyway, I'm an intruder into a debate there. I'm more familiar with what's going on the other side of the Atlantic politically. On Friday, there were two big decisions in England, which again have kicked up a lot of trouble, so much so I had to spend some of the weekend preparing an article for the London Daily Mail, which is a popular newspaper over there, which is obviously launching a big crusade about all of this. The two decisions were first of all, there's a town in North Devon, that's the southwest of England, where the town council was taken to court for having prayers at the start of their council meetings. Now that, of course, from an English point of view, would not be unexceptionable. And yet, the High Court on Friday found that they should not. And one of the reasons being put forward in the case was that, of course, there's a lack of equality here between religious and non-religious councillors, that non-religious councillors were made to feel second best. Now, actually, today the British government has made it quite clear they're not going to put up with that ruling. They're going to make sure that by the end of the month, Parliament puts it right. One government cabinet minister said something that I probably would imagine nobody on this side of the Atlantic would say, which is of Britain. He said, "This is a Christian country." And, but still, you can see that the whole impetus of equality is being used via the courts rather than via the legislature, via Parliament, to try and drive religion into private life and out off the public stage. And that's just one example. The other example was where a couple actually lost their case in the High Court. It was an appeal on Friday. They were a couple who let a room in their home in Cornwall for bed and breakfast. Now this was their home, it wasn't a large commercial hotel. And they were unwilling, because they had strict Christian beliefs, to allow unmarried couples, and of course that meant gay couples, to in fact share a room. You might think that's old-fashioned, you might, whatever your views, that was their position. And always in these cases, I think it's important to think, not do we agree with them, would we make that stand, but the position is quite simply, should they be allowed to follow their conscience? And in a free country, surely we have to live by what we think is most important and be able to say what we think is most important. If some people aren't allowed to, then democracy is crumbling because they aren't allowed to contribute to the democratic conversation. Anyway, they were fined and the fine was upheld. So again, gay rights, the claim to equality of all, was something that trumped the religious conscience. I have another cutting here, this time from the London Sunday Times. The headline is, "Gay Dean Tells Church, Make Me Bishop or I'll Sue." I thought, well, if somebody wants that much to be a bishop, I think that's the kind of person I don't want to be a bishop, but still. Anyway, Britain's most senior openly gay cleric is threatening to take legal action against the Church of England unless he's made a bishop. He'll sue the church for discrimination under equality laws if he is not promoted. Now, again, you can see the playoff between equality and here the freedom of a religious institution to operate according to the standards it wishes to apply to itself. I don't know how far he'd get in court. On this side of the Atlantic, of course, last month, there was a very interesting unanimous decision by the US Supreme Court about the so-called ministerial exception, which protected the right of churches to make decisions about who should be their ministers. Quite interestingly, actually, a similar court case went the other way just before Christmas in London, where the Court of Appeal said that a Methodist minister is not self-employed, and that had been the previous understanding for many years, that they were, in the jargon, office holders, but they were subject to employment law with employment contracts. Now, in one way, that might protect a minister because it stops him perhaps being subject to arbitrary dismissal, but in another way, it interferes very strongly with the right of a church to operate its own disciplinary procedures. And of course, secular employment law, equality law of one kind and another will immediately be brought into play. So the idea of a ministerial exception, which was recognised in Britain, seems to have been put aside by the courts. And that itself I find quite ominous. Well, Why does religious freedom matter? I've already suggested that it's very important that people be able to speak and act in accordance with what they think most important. And I don't think freedom of conscience alone is enough. Religion is always under threat because it posits a centre of authority that's independent of the state. Now, it may be positing a source of authority, God particularly, which a totalitarian government finds threatening. But actually it also posits a source of authority that the majority of people in a democratic society might not like. The will of the people might find that it's thwarted by appeals to an authority that they don't like very much. So again, there's the tendency for the majority to perhaps, if they can, bear down on the minority. And unless religion as such can be specially protected, I think it will be specially targeted, because it's more than just ordinary actions according to conscience. It's saying something more threatening in the eyes of a lot of people. Religion is often not seen as intrinsically important, particularly on the other side of the Atlantic. At least here in your Constitution, religion as such is picked out. You'll find in human rights documents the phrase is very often religion and belief, which begins to attenuate things quite considerably. So environmentalism could be regarded as a form of belief, for instance, and has been in British courts. I would argue that religion is deeply rooted in human nature. It's part of what we are. Now, that's a long argument, but again, if it's thwarted, it somehow challenges our very ability to flourish as human beings. Yet, in present-day Europe, in present-day England, religion, let alone Christianity, is easily put on one side. When human rights and human dignity are extolled, equality is thought to be the be-all and end-all. It's thought even more important than freedom, particularly religious freedom. Let me quote the Council of Europe. You may not be familiar with the Council of Europe. It's not the European Union. It's wider than that. It includes countries such as Turkey and Russia, but it is the underpinning for the European Court of Human Rights. So what the Council of Europe, which consists of parliamentary representatives from 40-odd European countries, what they say does have some influence. Human rights are seen in a recent document from the Council of Europe as being in opposition to religion rather than being underwritten by it. Now, let me say, I think that human rights don't just float in the air. I don't think human rights are important because we, whoever we are, think they're important. I want to know why they're important. What do they rest on? Why are humans important? Why do humans matter? And I suspect one very important reason is a religious reason. Humans, for instance, are made in the image of God, the Judeo-Christian tradition would say. But the Council of Europe doesn't see it that way. They come out of the tradition of the later Enlightenment, very much the kind of atheist materialist tradition of latter-day France. And, for instance, the document that I'm quoting from says, states may not allow the dissemination of religious principles which, if put into practice, would violate human rights. If doubts exist in this respect, states must require, I do like that word require religious leaders to take an unambiguous stand in favour of the precedence of human rights as set forth in the European Convention on Human Rights over any religious principle. So, in other words, the Pope must be required to put human rights above any religious principle. Now, what I don't like about that is actually the glib view that human rights and religion are two different things. Now, I've already said perhaps human rights rest on religious views, but more important, the right to religious freedom is one of the most important of human rights. And yet here, and so often, you find human rights put on one side, the right to equality, and all religion on the other. And so religious freedom is just forgotten, and yet the right to believe and the right to manifest one's belief is built into all of these charters and shouldn't be forgotten. Yet equality and dignity are too often seen as Enlightenment principles in opposition to organised religion. There's a kind of anti-clerical whiff about some of this. And it's forgotten that even the slogans of the French Revolution, I think, make no sense against a non-Christian background. Liberté, freedom, well, we have free will from God. Égalité, we're equal in the sight of God. And fraternité, well, how can we be brothers, or indeed sisters, unless, in fact, we have a common father? But all the time in this, and it works out again and again in various court cases, religion takes second place to the demands of equality and non-discrimination. Freedom of belief is not being respected. People are expected to keep their beliefs quiet. And there's a terrible tendency of courts to decide what is and isn't important to a religion, and that involves them trespassing on what I would regard as theological decisions. So, for instance, Christians in Britain could be told, and are told by the court, that wearing a cross is not part of the requirements of a Christian religion. A Sikh bangle might be important for a Sikh, they can do that, but a cross isn't. So therefore they aren't allowed to wear it. Now, I just don't find the idea of a court deciding whether a cross is or is not important for Christian religion very attractive. Even worse, let me quote a case which is going to the European Court of Human Rights. There are 4 important human freedom cases from Britain going to the European Court of Human Rights in the next few months. This is one of them. A civil registrar, Lillian Liddell, fought the insistence of her employer, the London Borough of Islington, that she register civil partnerships against her religious convictions. Now, she'd been a civil registrar for 20 years. The law changed, civil partnerships came in. She was being required to register them. She said, I don't really find I can. Now, again, it's not an issue about whether we agree with her or not. It's a question of whether she should have been allowed to make that stand. Islington was quite clear about this. Nothing should challenge gay rights. Gay rights took precedence over anything else, even freedom of conscience. Gay rights trumped anything else. So the right to equal treatment trumped all other rights. And indeed, the line is, of course she had freedom of religion, and this is the European Court's line too. She has freedom of religion because she's free to give up her job. If you take on a job, you have to take what goes with it. And yet I think that the freedom to be unemployed isn't much of a freedom. The other thing is, again, the court said, and this went through various courts up to the Court of Appeal, the court said, anyway, marriage is not part of the core belief of a Christian. Now, I would question that. I mean, the whole relationship of Christ and the church is likened to the notion of, in fact, a husband and wife. But who in a court is qualified to decide what is and is not a core theological belief? And it's even worse. She was told, of course you've got freedom of religion because you've got total freedom of worship. Again, remember, as I said at the beginning, freedom of religion is being narrowed to freedom of worship, not the manifestation of one's freedom. I mean, another way out in some of these cases is for people to say, well, of course, you're not manifesting religion, that's just a moral belief. It's nothing to do with religion at all. It isn't just Christians who are being, in fact, finding difficulty here. Just before Christmas 2010, the new United Kingdom Supreme Court similarly interfered in matters of Jewish belief. There was an argument about who counted as Jewish for admission to a Jewish school, and Reform Jews were protesting against the rules of Orthodox Jews. I would have thought that wasn't something that a court should get involved with, but basically the Supreme Court said that the Jews were operating a racist policy, and that issues about so-called racial discrimination had to override Jewish beliefs about matrilineal descent. So once again, principles of equality, non-discrimination, trumped religious freedom. So all the time, religion is made to take second, if not third place, to other principles. In this country, in the United States, sometimes the freedom of religion is named as the first freedom, not, I suspect, just because it occurs first in the First Amendment. I'm afraid all too often, in all too many cases, certainly in Canada and certainly in Europe, you find that it is being put on one side and trumped by demands for equality. Now, I'm not saying equality isn't important. Of course I believe it's important. What I'm arguing for, and I argue for in the book, isn't that religion should be safeguarded in all times and all places. It doesn't trump everything else. I'm asking for a balance between rights. It's quite a modest claim, really. There should be a reasonable accommodation. In the Lillian Nadella case, the civil registrar case, in fact, there were other registrars who could have taken civil partnership ceremonies. There was no issue about offering the service, so to speak. It was just they were going to make an example of her. She shouldn't have those beliefs, and if she did, she shouldn't have been in a job. That was the idea. Well, that's not freedom as I understand it. Somehow or other, we've got to accommodate people, and above all, accommodate them when we disagree with them as well. It's like a conscientious objector in time of war. I'm no pacifist, but I would stand by the right of somebody not to be dragooned into killing people against their will. So what basically I'm worried about is that rights are not being balanced against each other. Religious freedom is always being trumped by equality.
Thank you very much, Roger. We now have Helen Alvaré, who is Associate Professor of Law at the George Mason University School of Law, where she researches and writes about current controversies regarding marriage, parenting, and new reproductive technologies. Her expertise is much in demand these days. As a practicing lawyer, Alvaré specialized in commercial litigation and free exercise of religion matters. She drafted amicus briefs in leading U.S. Supreme Court cases concerning abortion, euthanasia, and the Establishment Clause for the Office of General Counsel for the National Conference of Catholic Bishops, later working with the NCCB Secretariat for Pro-Life Activities. In this capacity, she lobbied, testified before congressional committees, addressed university audiences, and appeared on hundreds of television and radio programs on behalf of the U.S. Catholic bishops. Professor Alvaré also chaired the commission investigating clerical abuse in the Archdiocese of Philadelphia, and as an advisor to Pope Benedict XVI's Pontifical Council for the Laity, and last but not least, an ABC News consultant. Professor Alvaré.
If you could alert me a minute or two.
Yeah, sure. Yes, sure. Yeah.
Greetings. It's good to be here today. I have so much agreement with the overall thesis of this book, but I want to mention a few good things about its execution to also encourage you to take a look at it. It has a wonderful familiarity with the law and the cases here and abroad, and is able to draw themes out of many, many countries' decisions. So it's very, very useful for thinking about global trends on the matter of equality versus religious freedom. I also find that it really does a very elegant job of treating both the strongest claims to be made by those solicitous of religious freedom and the strongest claims to be made by those most solicitous of equality. And I think it's very discursive, it's very balanced, very calm read, despite the controversies that swirl around us. I agree with several of the leading theses, some of which Professor Trigg has mentioned, but I want to highlight that religious freedom has been displaced from a more prominent place in many countries around the world in the name of a commitment to equality. That it's a difficult environment for religious freedom because equality and non-discrimination, two terms often used, are so highly prized in the legal and in the human rights environment in the world today. I think that this movement, the dilemma, has been justified by an underlying premise that I encounter all the time, that religion is inherently subjective and irrational. And even I hear bigoted and misogynistic and narrow-minded. Whenever I go into any environment, I've done 4 or 5 NPRs, and I'm about to head into more this week, they will often say to me, but we're science. Sometimes I want to be funny, but I go, ooh, science, now I'm scared. Because the impression always given is that I'm representing something subjective, but they don't have any subjective preferences. They don't have an anthropology of the human person. They don't have an ideology, but somehow I do. as a religious person or representing a religious viewpoint. This is very apparent in the current debate over the HHS preventive health care mandate. And the other aspect of this that makes it very difficult, of course, is that the language of equality and non-discrimination is the absolute touchstone of sort of the leading cultural meme in the United States when it comes to these terms, which is the fight for racial equality. And the language of non-discrimination and equality in the United States, it was one of our proudest moments when we passed civil rights legislation. And so when that language is used against religious freedom, it's very powerful. I agree also that people who are using the language of equality often do so without even their own full understanding of where they happened upon the unshakable conviction that these ideals, equality and non-discrimination, are crucial to the good life, to a good democracy. And I think that at the very least, in the spirit of balance, there should be a recognition that in many countries around the world, not just the US, that these convictions do come from a variety of religious traditions. That at the very least, those traditions' role in preserving the specialness of the human person, the equality and dignity of all people, should at least be recognized. I hadn't heard previously, and I really enjoyed that part of Professor Trigg's book about the cognitive science material indicating sort of almost an evolutionary, neurological need for people to search for ultimate things. And I think this is a valuable addition, this part of the book, in particular to the more often heard proposition that religious freedom is obviously important to people, given the common sense understanding that people's search for first principles, for the meaning of it all, is an important aspect of human flourishing. I think this cognitive science is an interesting addition. I am in dramatic agreement about the particular reluctance of equality advocates today to get past the equality trumps religious freedom claim into the substantive questions about whether in a particular case the equality measure at issue or the religious freedom claim at issue better responds to what human nature requires for human flourishing. That what we really need to do is get past simply the claim about equality. I'm standing for equality, I'm standing for religious freedom, to the question about what, okay? And where's the data, where's the evidence about what it is that you're talking about? I'll get into this on the birth control mandate in a little moment. But here I want to expand upon one particular part of Professor Trigg's analysis and how equality trumps religious freedom as I find it in the US context. One is how it's done in the language and the way that statutes are crafted here, right? They say this is a statute about non-discrimination or about equality, and Congress fills the preamble with wonderful language about how the purpose of the statute is to stamp out this horrible inequality and to bring back non-discrimination. And then, if religious groups are lucky, they get an exemption. So basically what this says is we're trying to do something good, but because of some idiosyncratic and not with the program, with the Congress's version of the common good idea that you have, whether it is that you wish to, at your religious institution, hire people who share your religious values, or you believe that marriage as it is understood in your own faith and in societies around the world for most of history is X and not Y, that these are now, by legal definition, a kind of discrimination by the way the statute is framed, for which a legal exemption must be given, and which, because every newly claimed human right analogizes itself to our most famous debate in the United States, equality based upon race, this is a really ugly place for religions to be in the exemption clauses of equality and non-discrimination statutes. Second, and this relates to the current preventive health care debate, that equality and freedom in the United States are increasingly claims arising in the context of two interrelated notions of essential aspects of equality or human rights. The first is that the right to express oneself sexually, however, is a kind of human right. that there's a development economist at Harvard, Lant Pritchett, who calls this sexualityism. I find the language sexual expressionism very useful. You see it in the language of the most famous language is in the Casey opinion, which used it with respect to abortion, but then Lawrence versus Texas uses it with respect to sodomy. It says, referring in Casey to abortion and contraception, these matters involving the most intimate and personal choices a person may make in a lifetime are central to personal dignity and autonomy, and therefore central to the liberty protected in the 14th Amendment. At the heart of liberty is the right to define one's own concept of existence, of meaning, of the universe, and of the mystery of human life, okay? So this is freedom. So anything that goes against that, and in particular in the sexual context, is not freedom. Second, and closely related, is the modern claim in the US, but really worldwide, that for women, sexual expression without conception, without babies, in order that their sexual expression be identical to men's, right, same outcome, is a kind of human right. You see this clearly in the language and the fight, really, over this HHS preventive health care mandate, that not only do people have a right to express themselves sexually free of children, but increasingly that women are not free with regard to this unless the contraception itself is provided to them free via some kind of government action, and even against the religious freedom claims of other institutions. This is a really strongly worded fight. Congresswoman Pelosi refers to people who object to this new program as wanting women to die on the floor. Kathleen Sebelius called what HHS is doing fighting a war against those who oppose this idea. It's not yet to the point where the mainstream is claiming that government similarly has to provide abortions free or women's sexual expression is not equal to men's, but we're getting very close to that. Ruth Bader Ginsburg's dissent in the Gonzalez versus Carhart case comes that, you know, without abortion easily available, women are going to go back to basically an old oppressive kind of patriarchal society. President Obama made oblique reference to this in his statement on the Roe anniversary, that he supports abortion because it helps young women, girls he referred to, fulfill their dreams in the same way boys can. So, and you see this in other areas of US foreign policy and government funding, that I think sexual expressionism, as I'm calling it, is increasingly seen as a human right. Well, you can imagine how this works with religions that have all kinds of prescriptions regarding sex. And additionally, because the main issues in which this is arising, contraception and same-sex marriage, do attach themselves to groups in American society that have historically been discriminated against. People with same-sex attraction and females, okay? And because this is the claim that here's our response, here's the anti-discrimination response, it puts religious freedom claims in this environment in a very difficult case. So, finally from me, I think that that there is a hope and a plea, along with Professor Trigg, that in our social and legal resolution of this, we take up the path that he suggests here, which is to express our understanding that there are times when equality claims are made in perfect good faith and with a real attempt to solve the discrimination at hand, that they really pose a challenge to a particular claim of religious freedom. But that in this when that happens, in striking the balance, the question of human nature and what is actually required for human flourishing, is it the claim being made by the religious freedom end, or is it the claim being made by the proponents of equality, be joined honestly. That everyone acknowledges what their view is of human flourishing and how to get from point A to human flourishing. That everybody brings the kind of social data that you can bring to the table to have that conversation. I frankly find when I'm having NPR debates, and it's usually 1 against 4, 1 against 5, on these conversations, that I am told that I'm coming with reams of data, and the Institute of Medicine report, and Guttmacher reports, and international development economists, and I'm not being greeted with that same kind of evidence on the other side. I'm told that science is against religion and science has the edge here. I think the solution, though, is that if we really look at the economics, the sociology, the psychology in this current HHS fight, we would see that at the very least, there is room for preserving a competing voice on the matter of the meaning of sex, the immiseration of women in a sex mating and marriage market where the mantra, unprotected sex makes babies and that's a problem, is sort of the main mantra of the establishment on this. Where I think that we need the competing voice of the churches that say, we value sex for all these different reasons. Sex is not simply about expression. We value children in a particular way. At the very least, I think if we got around to having a conversation about human flourishing in this debate between equality and freedom, we would find that even people who don't agree with the Catholic Church, in particular on contraception, would wish to preserve her voice. Thank you.
Thank you. And now we turn to William Galston, who holds the Ezra Zilka Chair in the Brookings Institution's Governance Studies Program, where he serves as Senior Fellow. He's also College Park Professor at the University of Maryland. Prior to January 2006, he was Saul Stern Professor at the School of Public Policy, University of Maryland, Director of the Institute for Philosophy and Public Policy, and Founding Director of the Center for Information and Research on Civic Learning and Engagement. From 1993 until 1995, Galston served as Deputy Assistant to President Clinton for Domestic Policy. He's also been working for many, many years as a political philosopher, written such books as Liberal Pluralism and Liberal Purposes. If I may say on a personal note, when I was a graduate student in political theory in the 1990s, I found Professor Galston's work a breath of fresh air, strikingly lucid and accessible when I otherwise found a lot of the work I had to be reading much less lucid and clarifying. So I'm looking forward to hearing Professor Galston's always lucid and clarifying voice on these difficult matters. Thank you, Professor Galston.
Well, thank you, Tim. As I made my way through this book, I encountered a problem. And that is that with regard not only to particular cases, but also the general theory of religious accommodation or the balancing of religious freedom with other considerations, I was so thoroughly in agreement with Professor Trigg that I thought that I might just say that and sit down. But then I wouldn't have been doing my duty, would I? So what I'd like to do instead is to raise some foundational questions that Professor Trigg talks about extensively in his book, but chose not to emphasize in his opening remarks. And this will have the effect not only of putting a few questions on the table, but also exposing you to the fuller breadth of Professor Trigg's thought, which is I think both capacious and impressive. As speaking as a non-Christian, I was struck by the centrality and understandable centrality of Christianity in Professor Trigg's account. He plausibly says that it serves as the basis of conceptions of equality, dignity, and democracy itself. I think as an historical claim, that is absolutely right. And he makes the following striking statement, where he says, the idea of the importance and dignity of the individual, on which much human rights law depends, took root on Protestant soil. Even the idea of religious freedom has been largely a Protestant construction. I'd be interested to hear what Professor Alvaré has to say about that, but I don't want to stir up needless quarrels. But Professor Trigg's position raises two interesting analytical questions. First, as he emphasizes, Protestantism offers a particular account of what religion is. And it is an account with which, for example, both Jews and Muslims would quarrel in important respects. Jews with regard to the question of how one enters a religion, and Muslims with regard to the question of whether and how one can leave a religion. And as Trigg also emphasizes, Protestantism is particularist as well in its account of the relation between the inner and outer life, which is a very important theme in the book. And Trigg goes so far as to say, and here I quote again, "It is difficult, if not impossible, to define religion in a way that does not already reflect particular prejudices." Now, there is some daylight between difficult and impossible, but it's not clear to me where in that spectrum Professor Trigg locates himself. But if it is literally impossible to do that, then that offers some very important challenges to American constitutional jurisprudence, where religion is taken to be a term of distinctions. Something is or is not religion for purposes of our First Amendment law, and it also raises some very important analytical questions for the issue of religious freedom. Because if it is the case that Protestantism offers a distinctive account of religious freedom on which we are drawing, then what do we have to say to Muslim nations? This is the way we do things around here, and your religious law is the way you do things, and therefore your conception of religious freedom flows out of your tradition in the same way that our conception of religious freedom flows out of ours. As Professor Trigg emphasizes repeatedly in this book, that's not a very satisfactory place for Western defenders of religious freedom to be. So, to the extent that Protestantism is at the heart of the matter, we need to be able to give an account of the conception of religious freedom flowing out of Protestantism that will command assent, reasonable assent, across the boundaries of other faiths. And I think we need to talk about that. The second analytical question, it seems to me, that this account, this Protestant-centric account, raises is the following. And Professor Trigg recognizes this. The historical fact that X is or has been the source of Y does not suffice to prove that X is necessarily the source of Y. Trigg, in his discussion, attaches the traditional name to that mistake, the genetic fallacy. But it is it's a real problem. In both Britain and America, democracy could not have attained its present form without a Christian underpinning. As an historical claim, as I said before, I think that's absolutely right. But even if we accept arguendo the theistic basis of rights in thinkers such as John Locke, and that is, by the way, a contested interpretation in Locke scholarship, it does not prove that rights must necessarily stand on such a basis. The book does not try to prove that there could be no non-religious or non-theistic basis for human rights, but only insists that people who say that there is such a basis come forward and state what it is and defend it on all fours with religion, which I think is a perfectly fair perfectly fair demand, and one that contemporary Aristotelians, modern natural lawyers, and even Kantians would be perfectly happy to take on. And then we'd have a really interesting discussion. And Trigg himself suggests that maybe things are a bit more capacious than that. He says, and I very much agree with this, that important concepts such as human dignity and equality should not just be asserted, but have to be part of a justifiable worldview. And then he goes on to offer a very interesting discussion of human nature and what we can learn from an examination of human nature about the basis of human rights. But in this kind of educated company, I don't need to say that religion is not the only intellectual basis for the exploration of human nature. It is perfectly true that as we explore human nature, we may find that it constitutes, as evolutionary biology seems to suggest, and as Trigg summarizes in his book, an important source of the religious impulse. I'm not an expert, but I have no wish to contest that proposition here. But it is also the case that we learn many other things about human nature, including many other things from Professor Trigg's book, that do not so squarely rest on the theistic perspective. For example, he argues, and I quote again, "If human beings can be free and rational, what we believe matters, and how we choose to act matters. We have a choice of which beliefs to adopt. That is why our conception of human nature is critical." Well, that understanding of human beings as free and rational is an understanding of human nature to which many forms of non-theistic philosophy lend very substantial support. And so once again, one is driven back to the foundational question of whether the religious perspective is as essential analytically for human rights as it has been historically. Furthermore, to the extent that one focuses on freedom and rationality, the ability to select beliefs, the ability to regulate how we act on the basis of those beliefs, one then has the basis for a broader range of liberties and a wider sphere of respect. And especially if one combines this analysis of human nature with Trigg's previous assertion of the inherent fuzziness, to quote one of his terms, or undefinability of the concept of religion, one is led to wonder whether the distinction between religion and conscience, on which he insists throughout this book, is really as bright a line as he suggests. I don't think it is any accident, comrades, that the U.S. Supreme Court decades ago, when not under the influence of many of these ideas, but looking at the issue of selective conscientious objection, was driven through empirical inspection of particular facts to the conclusion that there is conscientious objection based on non-theistic moral principles which have come to occupy in the mind of the person who espouses those principles a place equivalent to the place occupied by religion, and equivalent in two important respects. First of all, that these beliefs are not peripheral or optional. They are identity constituting for that individual. And secondly, that they are experienced by that individual as having commanding power. Now, I take the point that conscience is not inherently communal, and religious expression to a first approximation is. I think that's a very important point. But that then raises, and this will be my concluding point, I've made my way through about 3 of 8, but that's my fault, not Professor Trigg's. Or maybe it is Professor Trigg's, since he wrote too interesting a book. And that is that to say that religion is communal is not to say that one can read the range of religious liberty claims in any direct way off the communal practices of a particular faith. Professor Trigg has a very interesting discussion of a sukkah case, I believe in Canada, where Orthodox Jewish inhabitants of a particular apartment building were forbidden to erect sukkot, that's the plural of sukkah, on their balconies. They were allowed only a communal sukkah in the courtyard, and the Jewish council of whatever it was said, well, that's fine, that's good enough, that fulfills the mitzvot. There's a problem. Unlike, say, Catholicism, there is no central source of religious authority in Judaism. There is no such thing as a central definition of orthopraxy, right? And there are Jews with an extraordinarily wide range of practices, some quite idiosyncratic, if not wholly individualistic, which is why Judaism is as prone to fissures and and splits as Trotskyism, for example. And there's that's perhaps more than coincidental, given certain sociological facts about Trotskyism, but let me not go there either. At any rate, so I do, I do think that even if one presses hard on the distinction between the individual and the communal as a way of distinguishing between claims of conscience and claims of religion, that will work a lot better for Catholicism than it does for Protestantism, and a lot better for Protestantism than it does for Judaism, and that's worth thinking about as we try to cash out these general philosophical discussions in concrete policy terms. I have a lot more to say, but no time to say it. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Yeah, please, thank all of our speakers. They were all fantastic. Thanks very much. Well, thank you, Professor Galston and Professor Alvaré and Professor Trigg. I think it's appropriate to give you, Professor Trigg, an opportunity to say perhaps a couple of minutes of a response to what has been said before we turn things over to the audience, if you'd like to do that.
Well, just very quickly, because I mean there were a lot of interesting points, and so I don't want to not to go over and hear what everybody else says. There was just one thing that you mentioned, the fact that a lot of people think that religion is subjective and it's not science. And here's where I really put my philosopher's hat on, because this is something that I've dealt with a lot over the years, and yet it's coming up in the courts too. Can I just quote what some Lord Justice Laws in London said last year? In the eye of everyone save the religious believer, religious faith is necessarily subjective, being incommunicable by any kind of proof or evidence. It follows, he says, it can't be justified for any law to be promulgated to protect a position held purely on religious grounds. To do so, he says, is irrational. It prefers the subjective over the objective. So here you have this idea of the subjectivity of religion being used as a reason for why the law shouldn't really be concerned about it, that it's something to do with the individual. Now, I actually was very angry when I read that, because I thought, well, if I as a philosopher in a sentence just said what the law of England was on some very complicated issue, people would deride me. It seems that a judge can make statements in a sentence that I've written several books on the philosophy of religion, and get away with it, because I firmly believe religion is rational. It may not be true, but it's certainly claiming rationally things that purport to be true. Some of them may be very silly, some of them may be wrong. But actually, even atheists ought to agree with that. They're rationally disputing the truth claims that many religious people make. So they're saying, well, yes, I can see what you're saying, and I think it's false. So religion ought to be a matter of rationality. Now, where that comes from, of course, is old-fashioned philosophy that was prevalent in Oxford when I was a student there. And I won't say how many years ago that is, but it's rather a long time. And I was taught by somebody called A.J.N. I don't know if any of you remember him, but he was very famous for a book called Language, Truth and Logic, which basically said that religion is meaningless because the only thing that's true is what's verifiable scientifically. And this attitude, which doesn't hold up in the philosophy of science, again I could argue at great length as to why it doesn't hold for physics or anything like that, but it doesn't hold there, but many people who grew up around that time were imbued with it. A good example is actually Richard Dawkins, who, I mean, his whole view of science is very much what I would term a logical positivist view, coming from that kind of position. A very hard-nosed empiricism. Nothing is true unless you can prove it scientifically. And I repudiate that absolutely, but it's still around and it's affecting the way people talk. It's seeped into the ordinary consciousness, as you were saying, with National Public Radio and so on. So I think that we have to watch that. And again, it's an example of how judges trespass onto areas they shouldn't be trespassing on.
Thank you very much. Well, I'd be surprised if there were not many people eager to get into the discussion. I'd ask you to keep your question and comment brief if you can. Let us know who you are, if you would, before you ask your question. Oh, take this one. That's fine. Yeah. We have till 5:30, so we have ample time for discussion. Raise your hand. Yeah.
My name's Cody Smart. I'm a PhD student at George Mason University, also studying religion. I had a question for, I guess, Dr. Trigg, I guess. So on the idea of beliefs manifesting themselves, I wonder where the boundary is. Say we found a religion that was very much like Christianity, except it had one extra chapter in one of the books, and it said, every third shall walk in blindness. The way they manifest their beliefs is they blind 1 out of every 3 children. Would you not allow them to manifest that belief, or would you allow them to?
Of course I wouldn't allow it. No. I mean, this is where I would say that religious conscience have rights, but it must be balanced against other things. There are plenty of evil religions in the world, plenty of nasty views amongst people belonging to good religions. So we have to be very careful. And the problem is where to draw the line. When I started writing about this, I was hoping I could find some principle. And I don't think I can. I think you have to look at it on a case-by-case basis because it is a balance. And you just have to look at each case and see. For instance, a rather contentious issue I think coming up is polygamy, because Muslims want to practice that. It's a religiously recognized practice. I wouldn't want to allow that myself, just because it's religious. Because I would think that goes against human flourishing. Indeed, it goes against equal rights for women, I think. Actually, it's women who get downtrodden by that. I could argue a great length. So, I mean, I'm not deriding equality, but I just think we ought to give proper space for something else. But that doesn't mean it's overriding.
Stephen Baskerville.
Stephen Baskerville from Patrick Henry College. Helen Alvaré brought up something which I think deserves a lot more focus. And it seems that in the Western world, at least, most of the most serious threats to religious freedom come from the sexual revolution, whether it's not just homosexual marriage, same-sex marriage, but various things under the guise of women's rights. And there's things that weren't even mentioned today, I think, that we could be included in this. And I think this deserves, it seems obvious, but it seems like this doesn't get any kind of focused attention. If you even look at the conflict between Muslims and the Christian world, or the West, or other parts of the world as well, much of the complaint of Muslim radicals come from aspects of the sexual agenda and liberal sexual agenda in the Western world. I sometimes wonder if we're missing the subject here. Maybe instead of focusing on religious freedom, what we should be focusing on is this increasing sexual radicalism that is taking place all over the world.
I'm trying to think about and write on this more because it is fascinating, isn't it? I mean, you could go at this from a historical perspective, philosophical, theological. Does it have something to do with original sin, the theologian might say, that there is a his and her quality to the hereditary difficulties that the man and woman have, right? And is it simply a historical term since, I mean, you know, most of us would put our finger on the 1960s. I have a friend who finished a PhD in religious history at Catholic U recently on the Lambeth Conference in the 1930s over the pill. And she would argue it goes, you know, much further back than what I think it does. Is it that this happens to be the current sticking point, particularly between the Western world, and it is one of the complaints you hear? I was at an interfaith conference with some Muslim leaders from Iran, Iraq, Egypt, and it definitely was a sore point and a constant reference in their complaints about the West. So is it that we were bound to get to this because it's about a person's body? I don't know why it is the main hot point right now, but I know that it is. So I'd like to explore that with anyone. Yes.
Well, without wishing to dissent too frontally from what's just been said, I think it is worth remembering that there's a range of issues at stake in the contest between traditional Sharia law, for example, and the law that now prevails in much of the West. We're not just talking about sexual liberation. We're talking about a broader range of opportunities for what Professor Trigg properly calls human flourishing. And I don't think we can blind ourselves to the fact that many prevailing practices don't just stand against a kind of radicalism that many in this room obviously find objectionable, but also stand very much against mainstream guarantees of opportunity for flourishing that I think any decent society ought to be in the business of supporting. We haven't been very good at drawing the line, certainly not in the West, but that does not mean that everything, that all of the tension that now exists is illegitimate or represents the effort to push some sort of radical sexual agenda on the rest of the world. I just don't think that's a balanced account of the controversy that's now at stake. In 20 years, in some of these traditional societies, that may be the issue. But right now, it seems to me the issue is very much, do women as well as men have an opportunity to consent to marriage? Do women as well as men have opportunities for flourishing within marriage? Do women as well as men have opportunities to participate in employment outside the home? Do women as well as men possess elemental rights such as the right to drive themselves from point A to point B? I could go on, but I don't think I have to. I think the language of radicalism is a little bit too broad here.
Could I just add on that I don't think it is just sexual issues, because there are a whole area of other issues to do, for instance, with the end of life. Assisted suicide is much discussed at the moment in the United Kingdom. Euthanasia is there on the horizon. I can imagine that if either of those were legalized, particularly in Britain's National Health Service, and the idea was you should provide this service, and doctors would say, I didn't enter the medical profession to kill people, I'm not going to, then you get precisely this kind of battle. Then they would say everybody has equal rights to the access to the same health care, etc., etc., shouldn't depend on the conscience of the doctor. So you're going to get, that's nothing to do with sex, but you're going to get precisely the same kind of issue.
If I could add, I would never claim it's the only issue, but it is a flashpoint at the moment. And in the United States in particular, it's occupied a lot of press time lately in the last couple of years.
Yes, I'm Helen Alvaré, and I have a PhD in theology. And I briefly taught here. The issue is who is doing the definition of religion, religious law, morality. Is it just a few, male celibate? About a couple thousands for the United States? A few more for, or is it the totality of the believers that Vatican II called specifically the people of God? And this is what, for me, is the essence of religious freedom, is that I, as a woman in the Catholic Church, would also have a voice and would be able to say and write what I believe as a theologian and as a woman, and I would say also as a mother. But all of these things I want to be able to arrive at by a self-determination, self-thinking, self-affirmation as woman. And I am not waiting for someone else to tell me who I am, what I should be thinking, and what I should be doing with my husband. And this is a fundamental religious freedom and religious of conscience that has been affirmed by Vatican II. You may not be old enough, Miss Alvaré, to remember that, but I am. and I am totally out of the loop as far as contraception is concerned, but for me, it is a basic human right that is right now being in conflict with another basic, relatively religious right, but that is not determined by the believers themselves. And I would really make my points as strongly as I can. Women need to be able to determine themselves on this respect.
I guess the only brief response is on that is the question of when the law, because we're talking about the legal discussion here, when the law is looking at this, the question becomes, in the current controversy in particular, what has the current religious institution adopted as its policy? And the fact that the law has not got the jurisdiction to say, we're going to go take a poll of people in that faith, and we're going to say that that's their theology. Happily in the United States, even though it's suffered incursions on the order of this headline of, you know, gay dean to bishop, make me a bishop, the churches, the courts here have been reluctant to declare theology, and especially would not be inclined to take a poll, but rather mostly would accept some credible bona fides of the person or the institution claiming it.
A couple of questions over at this side.
Thank you very much. My name is Maria Jose Asum, and I'm a student at Georgetown University. And my question is directed to Professor Trigg. And you were talking about the drawing the line between equity and religion. The problem is, who would decide where to draw that line? Who would decide where to draw that line if the definition of nourishing the human being would be different to religious institutions and non-religious institutions?
Yes, I mean, I think that's a very good question, because the whole notion of human flourishing is itself a contested concept. I mean, I think a religious view of flourishing, seeing humans in the guise of a kind of wider context, is different from that of somebody who would just see human beings as a particular kind of animal. So it is obviously going to be very difficult. And your question, well, who draws the line? And we all have to live in society together, and to some extent the law of the land has to be involved. But I think it must respect individual consciences, and it mustn't intervene too much. I mean, to go back to the last question, I don't think it's part of the law's role to get involved in a theological controversy within the Roman Catholic Church. That's for Catholics to fight it out together. And that's for them to settle who has the authority, who decides, etc. And so the law must stand back to some extent if it's to respect freedom. But obviously, to some extent, it also has to hold the line. I mean that's why I think these are very, very difficult, fraught issues.
Thank you.
Well, as a matter of practical social life, at least in the United States, the default answer to your question is that in cases of controversy, it's up to the courts to draw that line. And interestingly, at least the courts in the United States have tended to proceed in very much the manner that Professor Trigg recommends. That is to say, not looking for some broad general rule that will define a bright line in all cases, but looking at each case in a very rich, fact-specific way in order to determine the magnitude of the burden placed on religious believers, and placed against the magnitude of the social good to be promoted or the social harm to be avoided. Now, once one puts it in terms of these quantitative assessments, which claim is weightier in the specific context, you have room for reasonable disagreement. You see that reasonable disagreement on the court and reasonable disagreement in society. What is unreasonable, and I think this was the mistake that the initial Obama order made was to implicitly or explicitly assign a weight of 0 or anything close to it to religious liberty claims. But within this general framework of balancing goods, balancing rights, there's room for a lot of argument among people who are equally devoted to determining the reasonable truth of the matter. And I think we're just stuck with that.
And in addition to, because I think that's a very substantial and fundamental question in this, in addition to the courts, the Supreme Court after 1990 said, since we don't have to grant, as a matter of constitutional free exercise, an accommodation to a neutral law of general applicability, and that in itself has its body of law behind it, what's a neutral law of general applicability, it really is up to you, religious believers, to go to the State House in your state, so to go to the federal Congress, and to make your case. And there, too, you have these competing notions of human flourishing regarding the precise matter at issue, on which the legislature has to, should, doesn't always do a great job, of taking testimony at hearings. I've done an awful lot of hearings, and I'll do another one this week. And they're too often shows and far too little, even though they're, and now that they're on C-SPAN, they're more shows, right? You can't be seen to be weak. You can't be seen not to have an answer. To say, oh, you know, member of Congress, that's great. I have to think about that. Let's follow up with this. No, that would be weakness, right? Everybody has to be definitive and strong. But really what we want is at legislative hearings to have experts who are really experts and not just spokespeople to come and talk about what human flourishing is and what their proposal is. And for members of Congress, not previously constrained by their parties, to say, no, you're always going to say yes to this and always going to say no to this, but to be amenable to reason. And one hopes that you get, and if you lose there, then you go to the courts and you try and do it all over again. People get very angry when the courts engage in what should be legislative fact-finding. But sometimes the legislature never did it, and the court does. It's tricky. But that is a very important question, and hopefully we do it at legislatures.
Thank you. Hi, I'm Richard Hyde. I'm with the Religion Consulting Group. And just to follow up on this conversation, Professor Alvaré, are the Catholic bishops preparing to litigate the current matter? And if so, you know, give us an idea of what your argument would be and bring us up to date on. You've referred to the Smith decision and then the Religious Freedom Restoration Act. It's a bit of a, it's a little confusing to try to figure out where the state of law is at this point, and how will you proceed? I'll try and be very brief so as not to bore the non-lawyers. I love the name of your group, first of all. Boy, that's an interesting employer. Essentially, you already have lawsuits, and if you go on the website of the Becket Fund, Belmont Abbey, and Colorado Christian College, and I think just a few days ago, EWTN, which is a Catholic television network, probably radio too, have sued. And so when you see their complaints, the Belmont Abbey complaint is very plainly drafted. That would be, that and the Colorado Christian case would be the ones to be drafted. Now, the law hasn't changed yet. The original regulation is promulgated. So those complaints still stand, right, until they decide maybe to retract them if a new regulation actually comes out, and then depending on what it says. But the complaints being made... Can you explain that, by the way? That's something perhaps people don't realize. That what was announced Friday was not an actual change. It was a promise to make a change in the regulations in the future, sometime during the one-year period between August 1st, 2012 and August 1st, 2013, when the regulation without a very broad religious exemption would otherwise be going into effect, okay, for these other groups that say we are religious institutions, but we're not included in the very narrow exemption presently given because we hire and serve people not of our faith, but are open to everybody. So the complaint as it's made, and I would imagine, gee, if it really gets to that point, will the Catholic bishops join a lawsuit? I'm not on the internal decision-making there, but my read of the current rhetoric would be yes, that a lawsuit would be forthcoming. you know, we're not at the phase where we're trying to influence the legislation. And in the old days, you know, and Mayor Koch would say, birth control for everybody at Covenant House. And Cardinal O'Connor would say, I'm so sorry, we're going to need a place for 1,000 kids by noon because we can't do that. Do you have a place in New York City to do that? We're not at that stage anymore. The legislation has been passed. It's promulgated. And so we have time. But Belmont Abbey's complaint says we win under Smith because it's not a neutral law of general applicability that you've passed here, because you've already granted thousands of exemptions, but somehow you won't exempt the religious entities. So how can the law be neutral and generally applicable? Number two, they're saying under the Religious Freedom Restoration, it's a federal law, so the Religious Freedom Restoration Act applies. Under that or the Smith decision, if there's not a neutral law of general applicability, they're saying you don't have a compelling state interest. You've already acknowledged that over 90%, the figure usually used is 98 or 99% of sexually active women use birth control. The data out there, Medicaid reimburses at 90% for women a certain level at, above, and below the poverty line. Many states make up that extra 10%, so it's already free. Most insurance policies already provide it. There's been no debacle under the last umpteen decades where Catholic institutions and others have not provided it. So where's your compelling state interest? And even if you have that, you haven't exercised your prerogative by the least restrictive means. There's many ways you could deliver more contraception into the public, although it's hard to see how much more you could get into the public. Even the leading study done on this, the Eden and Kafalis book, Promises I Can Keep, Why Poor Women Put Motherhood Before Marriage, they joke that they did everything but put it in the water in their neighborhoods, right? Because they were so eager for these women not to bear children out of wedlock. It's hard to see how you could push more of it into the stream of commerce. But, and the government, when asked, the White House said, well, we don't really know how that's going to work. We don't know how much more marginal penetration we'll get, but we'd like to try. So that's the legal argument. And it won't change too much, but there will be changes that are too boring to go through right here if the Obama accommodation becomes law.
Could I just make a general point here that I do think that it's important not to lose sight of the fact that if you take away the rights of institutions and the freedom of institutions, as the liberal state very often is inclined to, and to have nothing between as a buffer between the individual and the state, the result is always not more freedom for the individual, but more power for the state, because the state has to step in and start directing. And this is something that I'm very conscious of in Britain, where, of course, we have a National Health Service. And there's a lot of concern about the way in which, centrally, really, decisions are taken which completely cut out the family, so that now it's easy for 13-year-old girls to be given contraception, even in school, but certainly by their doctors, without the knowledge or consent of their parents. And that seems to me a good example of how the state and the individual cut out even the family.
Having said that, at least in the United States, and I am really struck by what I'm learning about the differences between the approach in Europe and the UK on the one hand and the United States on the other. There are reasonably robust legal protections for churches as institutions, for non-religious associations such as the Boy Scouts that were insulated from an important federal law through a Supreme Court finding, and for the rights of parents to raise their children as they see fit as well. And I don't think that's an accident, because both practically and theoretically, the brand of liberalism practiced in the United States has always attached great weight to intermediate associations. I mean, Tocqueville wrote about that, but he didn't create that. That was very much part of the American liberal ethos from the start. And it is very much worth preserving and strengthening. And I think I'm at one with my fellow panelists in believing that. But I think it's important not to paint the liberal tradition too broadly. It is not all Hobbesian or Rousseauian. It's not all an effort to destroy the intermediaries between the state and the individual. There is a counter-liberal tradition, which is, I think, even more influential in the United States, thank God.
There are 3 people I can see who want to ask questions. At the risk of having it go over a tad, I'd like all of them to be able to ask their question. I plead with you to be brief so that we can hear you all, and then we'll hear briefly from our panel. So first Richard, and then a couple of other people.
Okay, thank you. Richard Fulton from the American Jewish Committee. I have a comment and a question, both really directed to Professor Alvaré. The comment grows out of your analysis of how under RFRA there might be a claim to set aside the government's action. And what occurs to me is that if that theory holds up, it's not only about religious institutions. Private employers would be just as well placed to say this should not be applicable to us because RFRA protects us as well, which some of us would view as problematic. Perhaps that is a result you would like to see achieved. The question is, and this goes to the notion of making the case for whose perspective is contributing to human flourishing, which I think Professor Trigg may have picked up on as well. And I'm sort of puzzled about this as a way of working toward policy. It seems to me that the question is not to somehow convince the policymakers that the exemption ought to be granted, because here's also a valid theory about human flourishing with respect to what the particular rule should be, so much as to say, as a general rule within our society, whether constitutionally, although unfortunately the First Amendment and Free Exercise Clause ain't what they used to be, but either constitutionally or legally, what we want to be saying to policymakers is, yes, it's your job to figure out what's good for human flourishing, but you also have to do it in the constraints of a structure that takes into account the fact that other communities have other ideas, and that as a society with people who have very different points of view on very important things have to live together, we have to allow for other people, at least when there's a religious motivation or something equivalent to it motivating them, we have to allow room for those folks to have those different perspectives. That doesn't put upon the religious actor the need to prove they're in court, as it were, that they're right about their theory of human flourishing, only to say that they have a different idea than what those policymakers are. So am I misunderstanding you? Because I didn't really understand why that case ought to be made about human flourishing by the religious, those requesting religious exemption.
And I should say, I have a 6 o'clock panel at George Mason that I briefed for a year ago, so I'll be leaving in about 4 minutes. I apologize.
Just a point of fact, I'm a gynecologist, and Professor Alvaré said that 98% of women are using contraception. The National Survey of Family Growth says 98% of women have ever used. Currently uses 61.8%.
Joe Prudhomme, Washington College, about how exactly contraception in the considerable majority of cases is in fact health care. If you could speak to...
I will, real quick on that. The claim that it's preventive health care is being challenged by both Colorado Christian and Belmont Abbey on the grounds that it's not classically fit under preventive health care because it's not preventing disease. Second, it's being challenged because there is a provision in the Affordable Health Care Act that says that there will be no mandating abortion under any category, and some of these drugs act after an embryo is formed, and there is Germaine Greer has written about this in her book, The Whole Woman, that it's really not fair not to let women know this, that some of this acts after an embryo is formed. So that will be the religious groups are making that argument. Why? Because they're pro-life as a stance. With regard to, it's hard to address that longer question quickly, but what I was saying was religious groups, yes, first of all, the RFRA claim would extend also to secular employers who have a conscientious objection. Frankly, most of them go along with providing birth control in their insurance policies, although not some of the like Plan B and Ella, which can act after an embryo is formed in some cases. But they're already doing it. It's not terribly controversial for them. And we've had dozens, decades of experience with this, and it hasn't become a big issue for secular employers. It's probably the religious institutions that will continue to have the strongest opposition. And with regard to the statement about human flourishing, one of those statements is going either will win alone, or both ways have credible arguments about human flourishing, and therefore the accommodation. And so it's not that always one wins, is what I was suggesting.
Before I thank the panel, let me say we have a reception in honor of Professor Trigg and his new book. You're able to buy a copy of the book at the reception. Please stay if you can. Thank you all for coming. Thank you, Professor Trigg. Thank you, Professor Galston. Thank you, Professor Alvaré. Very much. Thank you all for a great discussion. Thanks very much.